June 19th, 1953. Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York. At exactly 8 minutes past 8 in the evening, a log entry was typed into a federal record book. The entry was brief, procedural, emotionless. A high-voltage electrical current had been activated. Inside the execution chamber, Julius Rosenberg was strapped into the chair. Minutes later, Ethel Rosenberg followed. Within a span of less than 10 minutes, 2 American civilians were declared dead, under sentence of the United States government. On paper, the case was closed, but history does not close cases so easily. That night, outside the prison walls, demonstrators held candles and placards. Some pleaded for mercy, others demanded justice. In capitals across Europe, crowds gathered in protest, denouncing the executions as barbaric. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet media framed the deaths as proof of American hypocrisy. Inside Washington, however, the reaction was colder, more restrained, and far less visible. Officials filed reports. Intelligence officers updated internal assessments. Analysts noted that the executions removed a security risk, but they did not resolve the deeper problem that had triggered the case in the first place, a problem far larger than 2 individuals.
Because while the Rosenbergs were being executed in New York, something else was already irreversible. 4 years earlier, in August 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic device. It had happened faster than American planners believed possible, faster than intelligence estimates allowed, faster than the models used to design post-war American strategy, and no execution could undo that acceleration. The official narrative was simple. Espionage had occurred, justice had been served, the threat had been eliminated. Yet beneath that narrative lay an uncomfortable truth that few officials could speak aloud in 1953. The executions answered a legal question. They did not answer the historical one. How had the world's most secret scientific project been compromised so thoroughly? How had a nation that believed itself years ahead been caught off guard by a rival it had assumed was still struggling to catch up? And most importantly, how much of what happened could be attributed to the people who had just died, and how much pointed to failures embedded far deeper inside the American system itself? These were not questions for courtrooms. They were questions for intelligence files. From the outside, the Rosenbergs appeared unremarkable. They were a young couple from New York's Lower East Side, living in a modest apartment with 2 small children. No high rank, no public authority, no obvious access to the crown jewels of American power.
That was precisely what made the case so unsettling. The Manhattan Project had been the most ambitious undertaking in American history, and the most secretive. More than 100,000 people worked across dozens of sites, under layers of compartmentalization, security clearances, and military oversight. Its success depended not only on brilliance, but on secrecy so complete that even vice presidents were initially excluded. And yet, somewhere inside that system, classified knowledge had flowed outward, quietly, gradually. Not in a single breach, not all at once, not through a dramatic theft, but through a slow, methodical process that unfolded quietly during a war when the Soviet Union was officially an ally. By the time the Cold War hardened into open hostility, the damage had already been done. In 1953, the public was told that the Rosenbergs had been executed for betraying atomic secrets. What the public was not told, what could not be told, was how much evidence remained locked behind classified walls. Signals intelligence had played a central role. It was critical in identifying the network. Decrypted communications had revealed patterns, code names, and operational details that tied American citizens to Soviet intelligence handlers. But those decrypts could not be openly introduced in court. Doing so would have exposed the fact that Soviet codes had been broken. That fact alone shaped everything that followed. The trial that condemned the Rosenbergs was conducted with one hand tied behind the prosecution's back, and with the defense blindfolded. Evidence existed that could not be explained. Conclusions were reached without full disclosure. Legal standards collided with intelligence realities. The result was a verdict that satisfied the law, but left history unresolved.
Even inside the government, assessments varied. Some analysts believed the Rosenbergs had played a central role in accelerating Soviet nuclear development. Others believed their contributions were limited. They argued the role had been exaggerated by the urgency of the moment and by the need to assign responsibility for a strategic shock that no one had predicted. Years later, when archives began to open and classified programs were acknowledged, the picture would become clearer, but also more complicated. The Rosenberg case was never only about guilt or innocence. It was about fear. Fear that America's greatest advantage had evaporated sooner than expected. Fear that ideological loyalty could override national allegiance. Fear that scientific openness, once seen as a strength, had become a vulnerability. The executions were meant to send a message. They warned scientists, engineers, and civil servants that the consequences of betrayal would be absolute. They reassured the public that the government was in control, and they drew a clear line between acceptable dissent and unforgivable disloyalty. But they did not restore the lost years of nuclear monopoly. They did not reverse the Soviet breakthrough, and they did not explain how a system designed to be impermeable had been quietly, methodically, penetrated from within. Those answers lay elsewhere. They lay in intelligence estimates written years before the first Soviet test, in assumptions about scientific capability and industrial capacity, in coded messages intercepted during wartime and left unread for years, in the blind spots created when urgency trumped security and trust replaced verification. To understand why the Rosenbergs mattered and why their deaths did not end the story, we must begin earlier, before the trial, before the investigation, before the Cold War had fully formed. We must return to a moment when American planners believed they held an unassailable lead, and when the idea of losing it seemed almost unthinkable. And that belief, more than any individual act of espionage, shaped everything that followed.
In the years immediately following the Second World War, the United States lived inside an assumption. It was not written into law, it was not debated publicly, but it shaped every major strategic decision made in Washington. The assumption was simple. America believed it was alone. Alone in possessing atomic weapons, alone in understanding how to build them, alone in having the industrial depth, scientific expertise, and organizational capacity required to sustain nuclear dominance. This belief did not emerge from arrogance alone. It was supported by data, intelligence estimates, and first-hand experience. The Manhattan Project had been a triumph of secrecy and scale unlike anything the world had seen. Entire cities had been constructed in isolation. Scientific breakthroughs had occurred behind guarded fences. Even senior political leaders had been excluded from the details. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shock reverberated across the globe. But within American intelligence circles, the reaction was more controlled. They knew how difficult the achievement had been. They knew how many obstacles had nearly derailed it. They knew how many false starts, failed designs, and technical dead ends had been overcome before success was finally achieved. And based on that knowledge, analysts concluded something that seemed reasonable at the time. No other nation could replicate this achievement quickly.
Pre-war assessments of Soviet science painted a picture of competence, but not speed. Soviet physicists were respected, but their industrial infrastructure had been devastated by war. Their access to uranium sources was limited. Their experience with large-scale nuclear engineering was assumed to lag behind American efforts by years. Intelligence estimates placed a Soviet atomic breakthrough somewhere in the early to mid-1950s. Some forecasts were more conservative, others more optimistic, but none predicted what would actually happen. This belief in temporal advantage became the foundation of American post-war strategy. Diplomatic leverage, military planning, and alliance commitments all were built on the assumption that nuclear monopoly would last long enough to shape the emerging world order. It influenced negotiations with European allies, it underpinned confidence in deterrence doctrine, and it allowed policymakers to assume escalation could be controlled because only one side possessed the ultimate weapon. Behind closed doors, the Atomic Energy Commission and the newly reorganized national security apparatus treated nuclear secrecy as a solved problem. Security measures were tightened, but the sense of urgency that had dominated wartime operations faded. Many of the scientists who had built the bomb returned to universities. Others entered private industry. The massive wartime security apparatus was scaled down, not eliminated, but no longer operated under emergency conditions. In this environment, trust filled the gaps. The Manhattan Project had succeeded because of collaboration. Physicists talked to engineers. Metallurgists shared data with chemists. Machinists saw drawings they needed to fabricate components quickly. Compartmentalization existed, but it was imperfect by design. Speed mattered more than isolation. The goal was not to hide information from colleagues, but to build a weapon before the war ended. This choice would later haunt American counterintelligence.
But in the late 1940s, few questioned it. The war was over. The bomb had worked. The United States stood at the center of a reconstructed global system. If espionage had occurred during the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, it was assumed to be limited. After all, the Soviet Union had been an ally. Information sharing, though unofficial and unauthorized, was viewed by some as ideologically motivated rather than strategically catastrophic. And if small leaks had occurred, they were believed to be manageable. What American planners did not yet understand was the difference between isolated theft and systemic penetration. Espionage was not about stealing a complete blueprint, it was about eliminating uncertainty. Every complex technological system faces the same problem. Engineers do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they lack feedback. They test, they revise, they discover what does not work by trial and error. The Manhattan Project had advanced by making mistakes that Soviet engineers would never have to repeat. By the time American intelligence began reassessing Soviet nuclear timelines, it was already too late to prevent the consequences. In August 1949, when seismic monitoring stations detected an unexpected signal, disbelief spread through intelligence agencies. The signal was weak at first, then unmistakable. Radioactive debris in the atmosphere confirmed what many analysts had refused to consider. The Soviet Union had detonated an atomic device, not a crude experiment, not a partial failure, but a functioning weapon. The detonation shattered assumptions that had guided policy since 1945. Estimates were revised overnight, briefings were rewritten, confidence evaporated. If Soviet scientists had achieved this milestone so quickly, then either American intelligence had misunderstood Soviet capability or something else had accelerated their progress. That realization forced a painful reassessment. The problem was no longer hypothetical. The monopoly was gone, and the question was no longer whether espionage had occurred, but how deeply it had penetrated the very programs that had been assumed secure.
This was the moment when the Rosenberg case began to matter, not as a courtroom drama, but as a strategic autopsy. To understand the Soviet breakthrough, investigators would have to retrace every assumption, every estimate, and every security decision made during the war years. They would have to ask uncomfortable questions about who had access, what had been shared, and why warning signs had been missed. And they would soon discover that the greatest vulnerability had not been technical at all. It had been human. When the Soviet atomic test was confirmed in August 1949, American intelligence did not immediately think of traitors. Its first instinct was introspection. How could so many analysts across so many agencies have been wrong at the same time? For years, the United States had invested heavily in understanding Soviet scientific capacity. Intelligence officers tracked academic publications, monitored industrial output, assessed access to raw materials, and studied the training pipelines of Soviet engineers and physicists. The conclusions had been consistent. The Soviet Union was capable, but constrained. Its scientists were talented, but many had been diverted to wartime survival rather than long-term research. Its factories were damaged. Its electrical grid was fragile. Its transportation infrastructure struggled under the weight of post-war reconstruction. Even its uranium supply was considered limited and difficult to refine at scale. Taken together, these factors produced a confident forecast. A Soviet atomic weapon was inevitable, but not soon. Most estimates clustered around 1952 to 1955. Some pushed the date slightly earlier, others later. But the range itself reflected consensus. The gap was measured in years, not months.
Those estimates shaped everything. They justified reductions in emergency security. They allowed policymakers to believe that diplomatic pressure could shape outcomes before nuclear parity emerged. They reinforced the belief that American scientists, having solved the hardest problems first, would always remain ahead. What those estimates underestimated was not Soviet intelligence, it was Soviet efficiency once uncertainty had been removed. Intelligence forecasting is built on assumptions about friction. How long does it take to discover a solution? How many dead ends will slow progress? How many resources will be wasted on ideas that do not work? American analysts assumed Soviet scientists would face the same learning curve. They were wrong. Espionage does not give you genius, it gives you shortcuts. When an engineer already knows which design paths failed, they do not need to repeat them. When a laboratory already understands the tolerances that matter, it does not need years of experimentation to discover them. When a production team already knows where previous efforts broke down, it avoids building flawed systems in the first place. The Manhattan Project had been expensive precisely because it was uncertain. Soviet development was cheaper because much of that uncertainty had been eliminated. American intelligence did not fully appreciate this distinction until after the Soviet test forced a reassessment.
Damage estimates began quietly circulating through classified channels. Analysts attempted to reconstruct how much time espionage might have saved Soviet engineers. Early figures were conservative. They spoke of months gained, perhaps a year. Those estimates would later be revised upward. But in 1949 and 1950, the analytical framework itself was flawed. Intelligence analysts tended to think in terms of information volume. How many documents had been compromised? How many pages of design notes might have been transferred? How many specific secrets had changed hands? This approach missed the point. The value of espionage lay not in the quantity of information transferred, but in its timing. Receiving the right piece of information at the right moment can collapse an entire development timeline. A single note explaining why a design failed can be more valuable than 100 pages describing how a successful system works. Knowing what not to try saves more time than knowing what eventually succeeds. Soviet intelligence understood this well. Their handlers did not seek comprehensive blueprints. They sought insight, confirmation, resolution of specific technical uncertainties that stalled progress at critical moments. American analysts initially failed to recognize this pattern because it did not fit traditional models of industrial espionage. This was not theft for replication, it was theft for acceleration. The reassessment process unfolded unevenly. Different agencies reached different conclusions. Some believe the Soviet test proved that American security had been catastrophically compromised. Others argue that Soviet scientists were simply more capable than previously assumed. Both interpretations contained elements of truth.
What made the situation uniquely dangerous was that intelligence services could not publicly explain their reasoning. Key evidence existed in the form of intercepted communications, messages that pointed to American sources providing technical assistance. But these intercepts came from a signals intelligence program so sensitive that even acknowledging its existence would have compromised ongoing operations. As a result, intelligence officers were forced to argue their case indirectly. They spoke in probabilities. They used circumstantial correlations. They relied on inference rather than disclosure. This limitation shaped the next phase of the investigation. Instead of starting with named suspects, investigators began with anomalies. They compared Soviet technical achievements to known American development milestones. They looked for areas where Soviet progress appeared to leap forward rather than evolve gradually. They examined which technical challenges had been solved unusually quickly. Patterns began to emerge. Certain solutions appeared in Soviet records without evidence of the experimentation that normally precedes them. Manufacturing techniques were implemented without recorded trial phases. Design corrections appeared without a documented history of failure. These were red flags. They suggested that Soviet engineers were not discovering solutions, they were adopting them. But identifying how that knowledge had crossed borders required a different kind of analysis. the focus shifted from laboratories to people. Who had access to information at the moments when Soviet progress accelerated? Who moved between institutions? Who had ideological motivations that might override security obligations? This was where counterintelligence replaced strategic forecasting. The problem was no longer abstract. If espionage had occurred, it had occurred during a period when America's security apparatus was optimized for speed, not secrecy. Wartime urgency had created access. Post-war complacency had preserved it. And intelligence agencies were now forced to confront a painful possibility. The Soviet atomic breakthrough was not a mystery caused by foreign genius alone. It was the outcome of American assumptions colliding with human vulnerability. The task ahead was not to prove that espionage had happened. It was to prove who had made it possible.
In Washington, August 1949 did not begin with panic. It began with hesitation. The first indicators came quietly, filtered through technical channels few outside the intelligence community understood. Air sampling stations detected radioactive particles drifting across the Pacific. At first, analysts questioned the instruments. Contamination was possible. False positives were not unheard of. But as more data arrived, doubt narrowed. The isotopic signatures did not match American tests. They did not match natural background radiation, and they did not disappear. By early September, the conclusion could no longer be avoided. The Soviet Union had conducted a nuclear detonation. For senior officials, the problem was not simply that the Soviets now had the bomb. It was when they had it. 4 years. That was the number echoing through classified briefings. 4 years from Hiroshima to a Soviet test. 4 years to replicate the most complex weapon system ever built. 4 years to cross a technological gulf that American planners had believed would take at least twice that long. The word impossible began to appear, not as an accusation, but as a question. How could this have happened so fast? President Truman was informed publicly on September 23, 1949, but the internal reckoning had begun weeks earlier. Intelligence agencies scrambled to reassess every assumption that had guided post-war strategy. Estimates were rewritten, forecasting models were discarded. Analysts were forced to admit that the margin for error had not been years, but months. The shock went beyond embarrassment. Nuclear monopoly had been the cornerstone of American leverage. It allowed planners to believe that escalation could be managed, that threats could be issued without immediate retaliation, that time was on America's side. That illusion evaporated overnight. Military planners now faced a world in which deterrence, not dominance, would define strategy. Diplomatic leverage weakened, allies grew uneasy, and adversaries recalibrated their expectations. But behind closed doors, the most urgent concern was retrospective. If the bomb had arrived this quickly, then something fundamental had been misunderstood.
Initial damage assessments were cautious. Intelligence officers avoided dramatic language. They spoke of potential assistance and indirect knowledge transfer. There was reluctance to accept the implication that American security had failed at a systemic level. No one wanted to believe that the Manhattan Project, a symbol of national ingenuity and organizational excellence, had been compromised from within. Yet the evidence kept pushing analysts in that direction. Technical comparisons revealed uncomfortable similarities between Soviet designs and known American approaches. Not identical, but close enough to suggest convergence guided by more than independent discovery. Even more troubling were the absences. Soviet documentation, where available, lacked the long trails of experimentation that had characterized American development. Certain design problems appeared to have been solved cleanly, without the false starts that usually accompany innovation at that scale. These gaps mattered. They suggested that Soviet engineers had not stumbled their way forward. They had stepped around obstacles already mapped by others. By late 1949, intelligence assessments began to use a new phrase, acceleration effect. It was a subtle but critical shift. The problem was no longer whether espionage had delivered a complete weapon design. The The problem was whether it had removed enough uncertainty to collapse the development timeline. This reframing changed everything. If espionage had merely filled in gaps, answered specific questions at critical moments, then traditional measures of damage would underestimate its impact. A few key insights, delivered at the right time, could save years of work. That realization reframed the investigation. Analysts no longer asked, what was stolen? They asked, what was no longer necessary to discover?
Attention turned to moments of technical difficulty during the Manhattan Project, phases where American scientists struggled, decisions that took months to resolve, problems whose solutions, once found, seemed obvious in hindsight. These were the pressure points where information leakage would have been most valuable, and that narrowed the field dramatically. Only a limited number of individuals had access to that level of detail. Fewer still had access across multiple stages of development, and fewer again had ideological motivations that aligned with assisting the Soviet Union during and after the war. This was the context in which counterintelligence operations intensified, not with public arrests, not with dramatic accusations, but with quiet reconstruction. Investigators began tracing networks rather than individuals. They examined social circles, professional overlaps, and political affiliations. They looked for patterns of contact that extended beyond official channels. The picture that emerged was not of a single master spy, but of a loose constellation of sympathizers, couriers, and intermediaries, each playing a small role, none necessarily seeing the full scope of what they enabled. This realization would later complicate public understanding of the case. The desire for a clear villain clashed with the reality of distributed responsibility. But in 1949, clarity was a luxury intelligence agencies could not afford. They needed answers quickly. The Soviet test had compressed timelines everywhere. Policy decisions that had been scheduled for gradual review were now urgent. Military doctrines had to be revised. Budget priorities shifted. Scientific research accelerated again, this time under far stricter security controls. And somewhere inside this frantic reassessment, a quiet determination formed. If American assumptions had failed once, they could not be allowed to fail again. That determination would soon translate into prosecutions, not because the courts could restore the lost monopoly, but because the government needed to demonstrate that the breach had been identified, contained, and punished. The Rosenberg case did not begin as a hunt for revenge. It began as an attempt to impose order on a shock that had destabilized the entire strategic framework of the United States. The problem was that law, intelligence, and public perception would soon collide, and when they did, the results would satisfy none of them completely.
In the immediate aftermath of the Soviet atomic test, American intelligence did what it always did in moments of strategic shock. It measured. Committees were formed, working groups assembled. Analysts were instructed to quantify the damage, not emotionally, but methodically. The question placed at the center of this effort was deceptively simple. How much did espionage actually matter? Early answers were cautious. Officials were reluctant to conclude that the Soviet breakthrough depended heavily on stolen information. Such an admission would imply that the most secure project in American history had been fundamentally compromised. It would raise uncomfortable questions about oversight, trust, and responsibility. So initial damage assessments erred on the side of restraint. Analysts suggested that espionage may have accelerated certain aspects of development, but emphasized Soviet scientific competence. They argued that talented physicists, working with sufficient resources, could have achieved similar results independently, just more slowly. This framing served multiple purposes. It preserved institutional credibility, it avoided panic, and it allowed policymakers to believe that the system had bent, but not broken. Yet beneath these carefully worded reports, doubts lingered. Some analysts noticed that the logic did not fully align with the evidence. If Soviet progress had merely been the result of parallel development, why did certain solutions appear without documented struggle? Why did specific design choices mirror American conclusions reached only after costly experimentation? These questions did not yet form a consensus, but they refused to disappear. The core problem lay in methodology. Damage assessment traditionally focused on tangible losses, blueprints stolen, documents copied, equipment compromised. It was a framework designed for industrial espionage, not for scientific acceleration.
Nuclear weapons development did not fit neatly into this model. Much of the Manhattan Project's most valuable knowledge was not written down in a single place. It existed in the form of judgments, trade-offs, and lessons learned through failure. Engineers knew which tolerances mattered because they had seen what happened when they were ignored. Physicists understood which theoretical paths were dead ends because they had walked them. This kind of knowledge was difficult to quantify and even harder to admit had been compromised. As a result, early assessments underestimated the cumulative effect of small, targeted disclosures. A single clarification could prevent months of redundant testing. A single confirmation could avert years of theoretical debate. But intelligence culture struggled to express this reality in formal terms. Complicating matters further was the issue of attribution. Even if analysts suspected that espionage had played a major role, proving which individuals had contributed most to that outcome was far from straightforward. Information moved through networks, not pipelines. Couriers passed messages without understanding their contents.